Hello and welcome to you all. It's great to see so many people joining us from right across Europe and indeed beyond to listen to, and we hope contribute to, this very important discussion on the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines across Europe. This is actually the first of a series of digital roundtables, events entitled United Immunising Against COVID-19. And this opening session, Starting Shot for Vaccines, will give the perspectives of policymakers, scientists and industry on the early lessons of the rollout in Europe. Future installments will address a range of pressing issues on the future of COVID-19 vaccines from the viewpoint of civil society, of patients and of other stakeholders. The events are hosted by the European Health Forum Gastein in partnership with the pharmaceutical company Valneva. The EHFG is an independent European health policy platform founded 23 years ago to provide a neutral and inclusive forum for the discussion and advancement of health, solidarity and equity across Europe and beyond. My name is Sue Saville. I'm a medical journalist. I was lucky enough once to attend the European Health Forum in Gastein, that absolutely beautiful mountainous spa town in Austria, back in the days of in real life, or IRL, as the youngsters like to call it, perhaps again one day. And it's of course due to the pandemic that we're reaching you all now virtually. And one advantage is that you can then watch this on replay later. It will be on the EHFG YouTube channel. To make sure you don't miss any future events, please do follow EHFG and Valneva on Twitter and LinkedIn, and you can check the ehfg.org website. Now, we very much want your participation, so do submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom, preferable to chat, please, and we'll take as many of those as we can during the discussions. You can use the chat function for other comments. There may be a chance for the speakers to respond to you directly. If you want them to reach them, please select the "To all attendees and panelists" on that little drop down there. Speakers might reply to that directly, or we'll see what we can pick up. Please also tweet today. You can use the hashtag United Immunising, and you can tweet at Gastein Forum and at Valneva SE. All these details are going to be posted in the chat, so you can pick them up there. Now, to get started, let's run a poll. We want to find out what you perceive to be the biggest challenge around COVID-19 vaccination rollouts. So we're going to show you now this poll that should have popped up on your screens. Pick one of them. Which would you say is the main issue? Is it vaccine production and supply? Perhaps it's about the new strains of the virus, the logistic hurdles like storage, administration. Is it vaccine hesitancy and the concerns around side effects? Perhaps it's vaccine access and equity, about rich countries versus the poorer. Or political communication and alignment on vaccines, is that the issue? Or other? If it's other, let us know in the chat. Speakers, if you'd also like to respond onto the poll, then we will see your responses too, and the poll will disappear. So while you're voting on this, I would like to introduce to you the first of our distinguished speakers today. He's John F. Ryan, Director, Public Health at DG Santé at the European Commission. And part of his brief is responsibility for surveillance of communicable diseases, vaccination, influenza, and preparedness exercises. So after the past year, I wonder if he's thinking, why did he take this on? John Ryan is going to help us understand the current vaccine strategy across Europe. But first, let's just check those poll results and see which is then the biggest challenge to COVID rollouts. And that's interesting. Vaccine production and supply, followed by access and equity. So, John Ryan, welcome. What do you make of that? Vaccine production and supply. Surprised?
No, I'm not particularly surprised given the setting for today's discussion. I think there may be a bias as well in the participants and the way they're seeing the problem. So that also has to be taken into account. But it's an interesting result.
And DG Santé, where you represent, they've of course been at the forefront of the Commission's activities in supporting the development and administration of the vaccines, with initiatives like the EU vaccine strategy, the plans for a health emergency preparedness and response authority, to be known as HERA, and the biodefense preparedness plan, the HERA incubator, set up recently to tackle the new variants. So can you give us, John, please, an overview of where we are now with the current EU vaccine strategy, its aims, its principles, plans to avoid future shortages and production delays, all the associated tensions that we've seen across Europe? Where are we now?
So first things first, I'd like to just mention that from the point of view of European law, the responsibility for the organization and delivery of health services is with the member states. And there are some exceptions to this, of course, in terms of the pharmaceutical legislation, in terms of the legislation we have on cross-border health threats. These are just examples, but generally speaking, it's the member states who should organize and deliver their health services. That said, clearly in a pandemic, you try and respond in the most efficient way possible. And that's why the Commission already in June of last year proposed a strategy on EU vaccines for COVID, and at the same time proposed a methodology for procuring those vaccines. So if you like, this is an exceptional procedure in exceptional circumstances. And the objective of the vaccine strategy was really to try and make sure that there would be quality, safe and efficacy of vaccines available swiftly for the European population, to secure the production of these vaccines in the European Union in sufficient quantity, and to use our regulatory mechanisms for pharmaceutical products in a way that where the products could be approved and checked as quickly as possible. And the mechanism for doing this was through a mechanism which was agreed in the same time frame, which involved the 27 member states and involved what we call advanced purchase agreements. Advanced purchase agreements are different from joint procurement in the sense that they involve as well financing of some of the upfront costs faced by vaccine producers in order to reduce the risk, in other words, of the investment, but also then carrying over into the purchase of the products afterwards. And we used actually a significant part of our emergency support instrument to finance some of that early development cost, if you like. Now, it was really a shot in the dark, I would say, an educated shot in the dark to choose the vaccines which should be part of the portfolio. And don't forget that when we were negotiating all of this back in June of last year and subsequent months, none of these products actually existed. It's not as if you're going into a shop to buy something that's already there, but it's rather these were products which were in development. And therefore, we find ourselves in a situation now where 4 of the vaccines which were involved in these advanced purchase agreements have now been authorized by the European Medicines Agency. And of course, these are now being delivered when the availability is there, they're being delivered in the member states. There's one aspect I'd like to emphasize is that there are no big and small member states involved here. It was agreed from the very beginning that there should be an equitable access between the member states. And therefore, the issue of pro rata delivery of vaccines to the member states means that everybody had access at the same time to the vaccines which they chose to buy. This is extremely important because it's an expression really of European solidarity. In other cases, we've seen, particularly in the last flu pandemic, we saw that only some of the member states were able to access flu vaccines at that time, and that's exactly what we wanted to avoid on this occasion. So most of the contracts have now been concluded. There are still some negotiations going on. And of course, we've now reached the milestone of 100 million doses administered and 130 million doses delivered. And we're negotiating, as I said, for further types of vaccines and further supplies of existing contracted vaccines. For example, the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, we now have a third contract foreseeing 1.8 billion doses of the vaccine between 2021 and 2023. So those are my introductory remarks. If you'd like me to speak about HERA, I can do so.
Yes, and just picking up on that point, though, you talked about the solidarity and the lessons learned from earlier rollouts of vaccines, but did that solidarity slow things down?
I would say it's extremely quick, because if you consider that the member states agreed in June to work together on this, and now already at the end of December last year, the first authorization was granted. So I think it was actually quite quick compared to other parts of the world. On the other hand, 27 member states competing against each other for the same supplier and the same vaccine would have resulted in a very confused situation. So I would actually argue that it's preferable to have perhaps a slower train than an express train in these circumstances, because at least everybody's arriving at the station at the same time. So I don't know if that's too difficult to understand, but what I'm saying is it's really, I think, important, particularly in a case like this where we have very strong inter-community travel and interlinkage of our economies and our services and so on, that we all have a similar level of protection. And looking back on the last flu pandemic, I can tell you it was the complete opposite.
So now, in terms of trying to ramp up production and get that capacity there, what's the role of this HERA incubator, as it's been named? Yeah. How might that play into things in terms of a public-private partnership?
Right. So I apologize, first of all, for the person who invented the word HERA incubator, because I think it's almost a criminal offense to wrap up ideas in those sorts of very difficult terms, in difficult jargon. The whole idea of this initiative, shall I say, is to try and identify where the future threats may be. In other words, to have a unified approach to determining where the threats may come from in the future. And we know, for example, that having a One Health approach and linking up the surveillance systems for animal health and human health is extremely important. So this is one aspect, knowing basically what's coming before it arrives. The next aspect is in relation to how do you identify the countermeasures which might be relevant for those threats. And this is the second part of the initiative. And the third part of the initiative is really assisting with the ramping up of production capacity to develop the products. And finally, the aspect of making sure that the products would be available to the member states when they need them.
And it's not just then about the quantity of vaccines that are available across Europe, but perhaps also the variety of different vaccines, especially now we're seeing new variants emerging. So how is it that vaccines will come, perhaps those might come to market later once the EMA approves further vaccines? How could future vaccines support and enhance this EU strategy that you outline?
Well, the EU strategy, which I mentioned, is a long-term approach. So setting up a system to estimate the dangers of upcoming threats, identifying in a horizontal way the potential therapies and countermeasures, which go far beyond vaccines, by the way, and then identifying and helping manufacturers to scale up their production, and to actually obtain in advance, if possible, supplies, stockpiles, or advanced purchase of these products. There is the shorter term issue, which I think you're talking about, which is how do you react to the variants? And the variants are really a big challenge at the moment. We started off in December of this year, December of last year, January of this year, with the realization that variants were not a theoretical possibility, but were actually spreading. And you remember the border closures and the very panicked reaction just after Christmas, when we realized that the UK variant was spreading, and then shortly followed by others. The big issue now, I think, is really how will this affect the severity of the disease? How does it affect the transmissibility of the disease? And this is why, as a first step in this new initiative, we decided to support a wider sequencing of positive test cases in the member states. So, in other words, to have a better picture on the scale of spread of these variants in the member states. And secondly, to work with the pharmaceutical companies to prepare modified or re-engineered vaccines using a simplified regulatory procedure. And thirdly, then, of course, looking forward to trying to obtain supplies of these future re-engineered vaccines. So there's many aspects to this, but really not waiting for the creation of this permanent pharmaceutical structure, which I was describing earlier on, but taking the short-term approach of seeing what we can do already to help with this spread of variants, supporting the adoption of mass production of re-engineered vaccines in the shorter term.
John, thank you very much indeed for setting the scene on the vaccine strategy. Do stay with us and contribute to our panel. I'm sure there'll be questions that the audience might want to put to you, but thank you very much for setting the scene for us now. And it's great now to have the opportunity to introduce to you our 4 other eminent speakers. We have with us today Dr. Thomas Stephan, who is the State Secretary of the German Federal Ministry of Health. He was appointed by Jens Spahn, the German Federal Minister of Health, nearly 2 years ago. Thomas Stephan is in fact a lawyer by training. We have Professor Beate Kampmann. She's the Director of the Vaccine Centre at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and a Professor of Paediatric Infection and Immunity, running research in the UK and Sub-Saharan Africa with a focus on new vaccines and vaccination in pregnancy. Also, Professor Odile Launay, Director of the Clinical Investigation Centre in Vaccinology at the Cochin Pasteur, Paris. She's also coordinator of the Vaccinology Research Network and has coordinated and conducted more than 50 even, vaccine trials. We have also Don Juan Jaramillo. He's the Chief Medical Officer at Valneva. Dr. Juan Carlos Jaramillo was born in Colombia. He was raised in the US and he's worked in various international pharmaceutical companies. He joined Valneva just 6 months ago at what he described as an extremely exciting time for the specialty vaccine company. Well, exciting indeed. What a time to be working in vaccines. Welcome to you all. So let me put a question first to State Secretary Thomas Stephan from Germany. So you're currently part of a high-level interministerial committee overseeing a task force for vaccine production and delivery in Germany. At the moment, what is it, about 18% of the German population now vaccinated? What sort of hurdles have you faced in your country and how might they be overcome both at a national level and a European level?
Yes, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me to today's forum. It's a pleasure to participate. It's indeed now around 20% of the population being vaccinated for the first round, and hopefully then we will make a good speed over the next weeks to come, to also catch up with, for example, the United Kingdom. Indeed, we have organized a so-called task force on a national level, which is in good contact also with the task force on the European level. And it's all about, I would call it, a risk-based approach about the availability of vaccines. If I compare that risk management process with the risk management processes that we have seen in the industry, it's all about identifying risks for the availability of vaccines, to monitor the risks, and to the extent possible also to steer the risks. That means on at least a weekly basis but of course the task force itself, the colleagues are working on a daily basis. We are looking at the available of the vaccines in our portfolio. We talk to the industry. We talk about logistics, we talk about distribution, the storage, and everything which is linked with that. But of course, we also look at the production side. And we talk to the industry whether we can help to produce a vaccine and, of course, all the products that you need for a vaccine in Germany and in the European internal market. And whenever we can help, we are ready to help, whether from a management point of view or for a financial point of view. And the most important issue is that, of course, we see a lot of, I would call them maybe hurdles for the time being. And John indicated that. At the same time, we should also take into account we need a medium to long-term strategy. And this should not just be a national strategy, but a European strategy. We need a strategy for vaccine production in the European Union. And to be even more blunt, we need a pharmaceutical strategy for the European Union, which of course includes the future production of vaccines in Europe.
And you talk about being united there, and we're talking about united immunizing, but there have, of course, been some frictions across Europe, perhaps where other states might want to go it alone. They might be looking to buy in vaccinations like the Sputnik or the Chinese version. It's keeping this solidarity then, this unity you refer to, how can that best be achieved right across Europe?
You know, I have some opinions on the question to what extent we need the solidarity in Europe. We definitely need the solidarity in Europe when it comes to vaccines, but of course also when it comes to what I call just the pharmaceutical strategy for the European Union. At the same time, John made that very clear, it's still in the competence of the member states what we are talking about. That means we need both. We need something that will bring us forward as the European Union and the member states. But if a member state is not willing to go with us, there's the possibility of an opt-out. You know, this is also existing today. So if a member state is not willing to contribute on European level, they can do whatever they want. This is within the treaty, within the European treaty, and I would never criticize that. But as a European, I'm fully in favor and I'm fully supporting the European approach of solidarity. And to be honest, I would even go a step further compared to what we did in 2020. To just give you an illustration what I'm talking about, I would in future times prefer an approach on the European level where we define jointly as member states together with the European Union a clear portfolio of effective and safe vaccines. And I'm stressing the word portfolio. In my view, it should not just be one vaccine, but a portfolio to be on the safe side. First point. The second point is we need clear principles for the allocation of vaccines between member states. You know, I guess John can support that and can support me in that. It is sometimes quite time-consuming to discuss the allocation and distribution of vaccines between 27 member states. We need clearer principles for that. And the principle that I clearly prefer is the pro rata principle together with the portfolio approach. And then I would like to add one more principle. I'm just questioning that. You know, who is then paying for the vaccine? Is it the member state? For the time being, clearly yes, for many good reasons. Or maybe in future times, should it be the European Union? Just to recall, the European Union, again, for many good reasons, has set up a huge recovery fund of 750 billion euros for the benefit of the member states to overcome the crisis. Now, we are not talking about how to overcome the crisis. We are talking about fighting the crisis. And that is why I think there are good reasons to discuss whether in future times, maybe we should also finance from the European budget the availability, the purchasing of a vaccine, question mark.
Thank you. Well, you raise a lot of very interesting points there. Thank you, State Secretary. Let's pick up on that politicization of it. Perhaps Professor Beate Kampmann, on that point then, with so many different forms of information coming out, there's been a lot of division in society, a lot of misinformation around vaccines. As a scientist yourself, how do you think scientists can help fight misinformation, counter fake news, communicate the right sort of information to the public, to rebuild trust in vaccination, maybe taking the anti-vaxxers head on or targeting those who are unsure? Beate, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, thanks. First of all, thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and thanks for this question, which is really very important, because there are facts and figures, but there's also trust, and trust is something that has to be built within populations, between people. And, you know, I come from an organization, which is the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who I believe have produced extraordinary input materials into the whole COVID pandemic by sitting on the SAGE committee just nationally, by providing international guidance, by also, you know, having a whole series of public engagement events, podcasts. We had a whole series of COVID-related materials. My vaccine center has put out a tracker where we track all of the vaccines that are in various clinical trials and those results without being invested in a particular product. So I think it is very important to see that people who give the advice are not in any way sort of conflicted by particular alliances. I think that helps to build trust. I have maybe, you know, a more personal view on how we might be dealing with lack in vaccine confidence. And in my view, we are doing probably more of a service to people who have genuine questions and are also there to listen to the answers we might get, and to, you know, to generally want to make an informed decision. And I think there we can go really quite a long way to tell people, you know, what's in the vaccines, how the trials have been done, what the safety data look like, and being transparent in that information of what we know and what we don't know. And, you know, I experience this daily, trying to convince colleagues, friends, and various other people that the record of these vaccines is actually very, very impressive. Not only the timeline in which they have been made available, but also how they've been rolled out and the huge safety database that we have now. And I think it's primarily the safety issue that people are concerned about, and the politicization has been, you know, an unfortunate side effect of this whole pandemic. And, you know, the media are very hungry for also often the negative news about the vaccines, and it's very important for us to stress the positive aspects and the huge impact we've seen. I mean, the vaccine effectiveness studies are now coming long and fast from Israel, from the UK, from countries with significant rollout. And, you know, to get vaccinated is definitely better than not getting vaccinated if you are living in a place where COVID is very prevalent.
Thank you. Let's bounce it across to Professor Odile Launay. You're working with some immunocompromised patients. How do you feel the role is in terms of your organization, reaching those patients, building that trust, perhaps getting the information perhaps to the young, using ways to communicate, and making sure that it's not just those who are compromised with their immune systems who get vaccinated, but those around them, that household group approach? How important is that intergenerational support there, Odile?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for organizing this meeting, and thank you for inviting me. So yes, indeed in France, we are actually very anxious for immunocompromised patients because they are at risk of severe COVID-19 and death. And the first data show that the immunogenicity of mRNA vaccines are lower as expected because we had some data in elderly showing that the vaccines were immunogenic for those populations, but in very highly immunocompromised patients, the first publications show that the vaccine response is low. And in cases, there are no humoral response. And we know also that those patients, despite vaccination, are at risk of severe COVID disease with vaccine failure. So to protect them, we need to evaluate more intensive strategy with more immunogenic vaccines. but we need also to vaccinate the entourage, healthcare workers, and households. And for that, we need to explain why it is very important to vaccinate the family and the healthcare workers taking care of those patients. And as you know, in France, we have a lot of vaccine hesitancy. And until now, we don't have any difficulty because we don't have a lot of vaccines. So if patients want to be vaccinated, it's difficult if the population is not in the high risk population or in the age for vaccination. But we know that we will have to vaccinate also young people, and it's very important, and also healthcare worker. And we know that for healthcare worker, there is a large difficulty to vaccinate paramedical workers. And for that, we need to explain, as Beat said, we have to explain how the vaccines trial are conducted, how the vaccines are fabricated, and how it does working. So it's at this time, I think it's time in France to communicate about vaccination and about why it is very important to vaccinate not only high-risk populations, but also the young population. And I think that if we don't do that, it will be very, very difficult to obtain collective immunity and to obtain the reduction of the viral circulation. So for me, and at this stage of the vaccine campaign, we need to do a lot of communication about the interest of the vaccine, not only for immunocompromised patients and healthcare workers, but also for the entire population.
Odile, thank you very much. So yes, so some challenges ahead down the line as the rollout continues. I'd like to bring back John Ryan now. He coordinates the EU Health Security Committee, which was first set up 20 years ago to coordinate responses. John, there's a question come in for you from MEP Juazas Olekas, who asks you specifically, given the recent developments, it seems that the APA, the advanced purchase arrangements, couldn't be applicable for the Sputnik 5 vaccine. Could the Commission share if there had been any initial talks about triggering the joint procurement mechanism for Sputnik at the level of the Health Security Committee? Is there any other accelerated procurement instrument that could also help benefit other vaccines? John?
Yes, just on that point, and to avoid any confusion, with the member states working from June of last year, a certain number of vaccines produced mostly in Europe were selected to form part of a portfolio. And I mentioned that 4 of those vaccines, among the many that were discussed, are now the subject of market authorizations at European Union level, and therefore can be used. Now, vaccines, the vaccine which you mentioned, and also the Chinese vaccine, were not part of that portfolio which was chosen, because of course they were manufactured outside Europe, and therefore that was one of the criteria as to whether we would have security of supply. Therefore, we're talking about a different situation and different channels, if you like. The first channel was a pre-selection of potential vaccines where we would have security of supply and where we wanted to have different types of vaccines in the portfolio. And that's the result of that is now we have 4 products authorized. Now, in terms of the Sputnik vaccine, there has been an interest by the manufacturers to actually pursue the approval of the vaccine by the European Medicines Agency, and there is a review going on at the moment in respect of Sputnik. But there has been no discussion within the community instances of creating a joint procurement for the product, because this would be I would say premature until we know a little bit better the characteristics of the product and whether it's likely or not to receive a marketing authorization.
Thank you very much. And speakers, thank you for keeping answers as concise as you can. There's lots to get through. Let's bring in the industry perspective now. Juan Carlos Jaramillo, representing Valneva, a manufacturer with sites in Austria, Sweden, France, and elsewhere. It's taken the unconventional approach, it seems, contrary to what everybody else is doing. You've gone back to convention and worked on an inactivated vaccine approach rather than trying out one of the new technologies. Why is this? Why is Valneva doing this?
So no, thank you. First of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here to sit in with such a very well-recognized panel. So yes, our decision to focus on the development of the inactivated COVID-19 vaccine was driven by several reasons. First of all, Valneva has the expertise. We have the validated technology and manufacturing platform. It played an important part towards our approach. The conventional inactivated viral vaccines have a well-established safety and efficacy profile. And such vaccine, as mentioned before, has a wide range of usage in large vulnerable groups, such as pediatrics, elderly, and immunocompromised. We also note that our VLA 2001 vaccine candidate for COVID can be produced on the existing manufacturing platform, which has been successfully used for years for commercialization of our inactivated Japanese encephalitis vaccine. So that was one of the main reasons that I would say that the company decided to go through this route.
And that's interesting. The question coming for you directly, Juan Carlos, from Jean-Pierre Levet asking to you, is there any foreseen date to get the confirmation for an order from Europe to Valneva? What about orders for a second phase, say in 2022? Do you have any inside information you're able to share on that?
So currently, no, we are still in discussions with the European Commission. But as you know, we just announced the initial phase 1, phase 2 data. So currently right now, what our main focus is continuing to developing our clinical program in order to have positive results by the end of this year.
Thank you. And back to Secretary of State Thomas Stephan. Perhaps there's a question here for you from those that are coming in. We're being asked, and I don't know if you know this from your national perspective, but is the news of the sharing of production among EU of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine? Apparently, it's been reported that the Italian government is working to produce it in Italy. Do you know what's going on here? Do you have an insight into this?
No, at the end of the day, in my view, again, the development and the production of a vaccine is not a national matter. It's really a European and international matter of cooperation. And that is why, as I have indicated, we are in close contact with the industry. And again, we are also in close contact with the task force on the European level, because we have to stand together and to work together. And of course, we know from the industry that they are looking around, and they are also looking for good, reliable partners to produce a vaccine and to make sure that they have good working network of partners around the globe. This is not about, let's say, producing and building up networks on a national basis. It's really about part of the internal European market, and it's about the international cooperation. And under the German presidency last year, we had long and intensive discussions about the setting up of the pharmaceutical strategy, because we have clearly made clear to the outside world that Europe for the time being is highly dependent on countries and regions like China and India when it comes to the production of drugs and, of course, today, vaccines. And the question simply was put on the table whether we should continue with that dependence, or whether we should stand on our own feet in the European Union. And you know, the truth is somewhere in the middle. We need the international cooperation, but we should be stronger as Europeans. And exactly that is why we are talking to the industry, how to be a little bit more independent, while at the same time finding reliable partners on the global level.
Thank you. And picking up that international theme that you raised there, turning to Beata, your work is so much globally, internationally focused, with the principle perhaps that we now understand that no one is safe until everyone is safe with something like a pandemic out there. So what can the international community do to help to drive this forward, the science globally, to share products fairly? And perhaps just to tie into that, there's a question come in directly for you from Marina Dorf-Müller, who says, have there been some national good practices that you've seen that have been shown to be efficient on vaccine hesitancy, targeting persons with vulnerable attributes that might be subjected to higher rates of hesitancy? A lot in there, but give us your global view.
Okay, I think these are quite two different issues. One is about vaccine confidence. I'll come to that secondly. And the first one is about the international setting. Now, just to reflect on the numbers, right? In Israel, over 60% of the population are now vaccinated. In the UK, it's over 50%. Brazil, about 16%, India, with a massive outbreak at the moment, 7%, Africa, less than 1%. So, you know, the equity is far from actually being implemented. There are important initiatives such as COVAX that has shipped over 39 million vaccines to over 110 participating countries. And that is going quite well, but also will only address, you know, a maximum of 20% of the population. I mean, to some degree, you know, we need to reflect on what the vaccines are supposed to achieve. And 20% of the population might be okay to save lives in terms of preventing the most vulnerable from getting seriously ill. And I think that needs to remain a first priority, because if we ruin the health centers, the health sector in various countries internationally, that has massive knock-on effects, not just in terms of individuals' health, but economical and personal ethical consequences, of course. So I think as we're aiming for a wider reach of vaccines into societies everywhere, we really need to ramp up the production. And this is where obviously the words of John and Thomas are really important, because it can only be done by having a supply chain that is sustainable, that is amplified, that has brought in other products to, you know, reasonable prices, etc. So that's a huge task, but it's a task that we need to follow. And there are some other international efforts. There's the One World Protected effort that was founded in Washington and Geneva last week. And there's some new investment opportunities. And there's also the initiative to actually waive patents. I'm not an expert in this, but the idea is that we're letting countries create their own generic versions of the jabs. And that might actually enable countries to ramp up vaccine production in areas, maybe not I agree with Thomas that on a national basis, this is probably completely unrealistic, but on a regional basis, this might have some traction. And this whole movement around vaccines for the people, or the people's vaccine, is something that we really do need to start thinking about, because there's no way that 2 or 3 companies can give vaccines to the world.
Just a quick word. If I may cut across you there, because I appreciate on the vaccine hesitancy, we've touched on that, and put a point there to Odile then about the new variants that are arising, the need to keep up, for the science to keep up. Odile, what do you think? Do you see any epidemiological trends with these mutations that are arising around the globe? What sort of good practices? How can science keep up?
As we said previously, the emergence of variants is a source of interest and concern, because we don't know exactly if the available vaccine will be effective against the variants and against all the variants. So we need to have a very serious surveillance about that. We know at this time that in vitro and in vivo data show actually that the vaccine immune response is effective against variants, actual variants, but we don't know exactly what will be the epidemiology and the epidemiology of new variants in the future. So of course, it's a very, very important question. And we know that probably the different vaccine will not be equivalent for this problematic. And we will know exactly at what time we will done a booster for the pre-immunized patients, and which boost will be done if it will be a boost with the same vaccine, with the same Wuhan variant, or with another. So it's of course a very important question for the future and for next year, we think, yes.
Thank you, Adil. And back to John Ryan, a question that's come in. What is the Commission position with regards to countries neighbouring and training with EU, but not having access to their vaccine supplies? Perhaps this is the West Balkans. What's the situation there?
Yeah, there are specific arrangements which we're putting in place for neighbourhood countries, particularly the Western Balkans. But these are limited as well by the capacity of EU producers to produce for the European market and then to have sufficient supply to share with other parts of Europe. So this is really the issue which we have at the moment, the question of availability of supply. And also you've seen the difficulties which we have with AstraZeneca and with Johnson & Johnson, and this further confuses the situation.
Thank you. Let's take some more of the questions that are coming in. This one is raised about the role of intellectual property, saying, how does John Ryan and Thomas Stephan view the role of IP in assisting or hindering access to COVID-19 vaccines? Well, John, we just heard from you, Thomas Stephan, and then I'd like to put that to Juan Carlos from the industry. What about the role of intellectual property? Briefly, if I may, to you both. Thomas first.
You know, the question of intellectual property, in my view, is very much linked with the question whether in future times the sovereigns, the member states, the European Commission, or other players should take over parts of the industry to develop and to produce vaccines. My answer would be no. We should keep that with the industry. The industry has the flexibility. The industry has the capacities to do what they did in the past. And to be very honest, and that was indicated by several speakers, this vaccine story of 2020 is a success story, because when we started the discussion about vaccines in spring 2020, and when President Trump invited producers to a roundtable in Washington, including CureVac, one of the German producers, and then the German state stepped in with a CureVac because we became a shareholder of CureVac. They indicated to us that maybe at the end of 2020, there might be a first vaccine. And then we discussed that internally and externally with experts. And their answer was, you are stupid, you are totally crazy, this is not possible until the end of 2020. Now the industry made it possible, of course, with huge support also from the member states, from the European Commission and others, but it's the story also of the, let's say, flexibility of the industry. And that is why I would like to keep that with the industry. And what are the triggers? What are the main elements to drive the industry forward? Maybe one element is the protection of intellectual property. And that is why I would clearly distinguish the task of the industry and, on the other hand, the task how to support the industry by the member states and by the states.
Thank you. Well, let's bounce that over to industry. Juan Carlos, what do you make of trying to balance the protection of your intellectual property with the desire perhaps to share, and for companies like smaller or mid-sized like Valneva to be nimble and to be able to react quickly as new variants and new situations emerge?
Yeah, so no, it's a very good question. And I think that Thomas, the way he had placed it, of course, yes, where should it lead? I think that's a debate that will continue to happen. And I think more clarification needs. And I think there's a specific process that needs to be put in place in order to well define that. Regarding mid-sized companies like ours, we do reach out to academic centers, scientific organizations in order to obtain that. But for us, what we also need is future support in the sense from resources, both from an economical perspective, grants and so forth, to make sure that we could obtain those strains as soon as possible in order that we can adapt quickly to the new variants that are coming or emergent. So that's one of the requests that we also see. It's important. Yes, we should keep it, but it should be very well organized in the sense of how the process happens.
Thank you. And in terms of increasing the vaccination portfolio, a greater range of vaccines and indeed the technologies and those they can reach, Odile, on your specialism, understanding vaccination with young people, what would you say is important in terms of when young people can get vaccination?
I think that the difficulty is to vaccinate people not for protect them against a possible severe disease, but to protect other people and to decrease viral circulation. So to do that, I think that we need to have a vaccine with a good safety, of course, and a good acceptance in the population. And I think that for the future, we need to know exactly what is the burden of disease for COVID for young people, but we know that we can see long COVID-19 in children, for example. We have those cases sometimes, but it's very rare. And it's not easy to recommend a vaccination for children if they are not at risk for severe disease. So for me, it's a real discussion, and immunologists say also that it will be better to be infected than to be vaccinated for the immune response, in fact. So I think that the question of vaccination for children is not it's not finished at this time.
Thank you. And very briefly, Beata, do you want to add just a couple of words on that about vaccination with children? What data do we need before we're ready to head that way?
So as Odile was saying, it would primarily be addressing reduction of transmission. We need the data of how transmission is happening from children, particularly in institutional settings such as schools and also universities. We need to have age de-escalation studies which show the safety and immunogenicity in the vaccines in children. And we need to if we go very low in the age groups, we need to have these vaccine interference studies. But I don't think that will be a priority. I think students and adolescents and people who actually socialize quite a lot would be a priority for now.
Thank you. Let's go to another question that's come in. Where the question that we posed in the poll earlier about the biggest challenge to the rollout, and she wants to know from each of you very briefly, how would you have answered that question that was posed to the audience? So very briefly, Thomas Stefan, what do you see very briefly as from that poll, the biggest challenge?
Maybe a swap, because I would love to hear the Commission first and then respond to that.
That's cheating. That's cheating. Okay, let's hear the Commission first.
Well,
John Ryan, what's the biggest challenge of the ones on the poll, if you can remember them?
No, I can't remember the actual question. So.
I don't know if we could bring the poll up again and put it in front of you. It might be quite interesting to see. Here we go. So don't be influenced by the vote from the audience. What would you say, John Ryan, is the biggest challenge?
Well, the biggest challenge is really the relationship with the public, I would say, when you have several vaccines which are on the market, different scientific information coming in as we speak, decisions being made to change labels, and all of this creates confusion, I think, in the public. So the fact that we do have a portfolio with several vaccines is a great advantage, I would say, for Europe, and we will have more. But this also poses a very strong communication challenge when we're talking to the public. And I'm a little bit disturbed when I see refusal to take certain vaccines and reluctance to take others. I think this is really fairly worrying. Thank you.
Thank you. So Thomas Stefan, briefly, which of those would you have voted for?
You know, for me, the biggest challenge is that we as Europeans, we have to stand together also in future times when it comes to the negotiation for vaccines and the production of vaccines in the European Union. And secondly, I also would like to express my support for each and every, let's say, approach that would mean in future times we have better benchmarking or best practices when it comes to the communication with our populations, to convince the population that to be vaccinated, and to really exchange our experiences on a national basis and between member states.
Thank you both. I'm sure Beata and Odile are going to be briefer and tell me very quickly which of those on the list you would have voted for. Beata.
Yeah, so I was torn between can I just see them again? So I was torn between the availability between rich and poor countries and the vaccine production and supply. In the end, I decided for vaccine production and supply, because I think if we had unlimited production, unlimited supply, the equity issue wouldn't be quite so burning.
Interesting, and those were the top two anyway. That's really helpful. Odile, which one would you have gone for?
For me, the more difficult is communication for the public, but also for healthcare workers, because we know that healthcare workers are very important in the dispositif to convince their patients. So for me, the more important at this time is to convince the population to be vaccinated, and to be vaccinated perhaps each year in the future.
Thank you. And from the industry perspective, Juan Carlos, which would you vote for?
Yeah, so as a physician, of course, vaccine hesitancy is making sure that we educate correctly and we show, what the side effects are compared to what's out there. But I think also vaccine production and supply. So we need sufficient vaccines on the market in order to vaccinate the people. I think the educational piece does have to be made an extra effort, but if we don't have vaccines in the market, what's the sense of educating if there's always going to be a shortage?
Thank you. You've all made some really interesting closing remarks, but we did ask you in advance if you might prepare a little tweet. 280 characters is your maximum. A sum up thought, perhaps something positive to look ahead about the rollout of vaccines. Very, very briefly, if you would. Thomas Stefan, do you have a final thought for us?
No, maybe the final thought is that in future times, we simply have to be better prepared for the next crisis and the next pandemic to come. Because, it's a challenge for all of us to overcome the effects of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. And maybe let's see what will happen beyond 21. But we should, in parallel, really draw the right conclusions from today's experience to be better prepared for the next pandemic to come. It will come, maybe in another form and in a different way. But again, we have to set up processes which are effective and efficient to tackle this crisis that may come in future times. Whether it's linked with a pandemic or with vaccination, I simply don't know. But again, it's also about European processes to be as efficient as possible.
Thank you. You've gone over your 280 characters, I'm afraid. But John Ryan, very briefly, you're just.
Well, I'm very grateful to Thomas because he stole my tweet. I would make a prediction to Thomas and to the others online. The next problem we'll have is antimicrobial resistance.
Okay,
whatever else happens, that's the next problem we're going to have. And
Indeed.
don't say we didn't know about it.
Indeed.
I will just use my last word to say, on these types of occasions, I always want to congratulate our healthcare workers, congratulate them and thank them, because they've been on the front line now for over a year. It's one thing working in an office; it's quite another thing working in a ward. And really, when I see the photographs, I'm really heartbroken.
Thank you. Beata, your final short thought.
Yeah, I mean, there are continuing challenges, but there are also examples of excellent practice in the vaccine development that we've seen, and evaluation and deployment as well. And I think we should build on those for a future, which is very much placed in a global context rather than national interest only.
Lovely. And Odile?
I have no further word, because I think that everything was the speaking, but I think that we are very lucky to have an effective vaccine, and for me it will be a very, very important I don't know what is the term in English, in vaccinology, is really a success for vaccine, and I hope that it could be the possibility to increase vaccine confidence.
Thank you. Juan Carlos, briefly.
So the importance of mid-sized biotech companies for innovation. As you know, almost 80% of the COVID vaccines have actually came out of small biotech companies. So investment in the mid-sized companies and working closely together in a very transparent way is one of my key takeaways.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to all the speakers. So on behalf of the EHFG and Valneva, and on behalf of all our audience right across Europe and beyond, I'd like to thank all our speakers for their wonderful, insightful contributions. The discussions, of course, will go on, and there will be further digital roundtables in this series, United Immunising Against COVID-19, bringing the perspectives of other stakeholders. So to find out more, do follow EHFG and Valneva on Twitter, visit the ehfg.org website. Thank you all for your contributions. Thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.